Slovenia is hardly the country you think of when you hear the phrase ethnic cleansing or genocide or killing field. And that's exactly what happened here in the aftermath of World War II. And these are going to be some of the places and the themes that we're going to explore on the weekend that I'm spending here. After World War II, the Yalta Conference established what would happen to Europe, but it never really mentioned what would happen to Yugoslavia. And although it doesn't really seem like this is the war-torn Yugoslavia, Slovenia did declare independence from the Yugoslavs in 1991 and followed with a 10-day war that killed fewer than 100 people. One of the engagements in that war we'll see a little bit farther up north, and we'll also explore some of the ethnic cleansing that took place on the hands of Yugoslav partisans and the killing of German civilians and different ethnic groups as they tried to flee to more friendly allies in Austria to the north. Here looks to be the other mass grave. You see, they were scattered in two separate mass graves, so my opinion is that they were killed around the same time. The other one here, which I believe is the one that contains 7, and then this one, which contains 6. And in most of the places they would build industrial plants or parking lots over them and then just deny it ever happened. But I think in this case they just led them off because the war had just recently ended and they thought that they could operate, with impunity, so they led them off into the mountains. And you can see the beautiful scenery over there. And just as I was about to say that there was no memorial for these Ukrainians, behind me is the memorial to Belvode 1. Now there's 2 mass graves and they're both about 100 meters from each other, but this is the cross for the Ukrainians. It's very new. You can see there's no other crosses around it, and it looks to me like they were buried here in this ravine, and not too much flair to it, but they only discovered this one a few years ago. Maribor is to Croatians what Katyn is to the Poles, I would say, or it should be. After the fall of the Axis powers, again, the Yalta Conference left in limbo what would happen to Yugoslavia, and most people knew they would fall behind the Iron Curtain. And already Yugoslav partisans were taking positions in government and setting up their own political machine that would help them fall in the Eastern Bloc. And immediately after the war, everybody trying to flee to Western democracies, Austria, Germany, places like this, they were thrown in prison camps, and they were treated no differently than prisoners of war like SS and Ustasi and Serbian militias. They were all put together because they were all, in their eyes, traitors of the revolution. Along with them were just thrown in ethnic Germans who were doing nothing. They were just evicted from their houses. Same with Italians. And in May 1945, 15,000 of them were brought to this forest. And the strategic importance of this town, Maribor, can't really be understated for World War II. There were anti-tank trenches all around the town. Same goes for a town near it. I think it's called Silje. And they lined them up in these trenches and executed them. And the description of the execution is they would line them on the trench and machine gun them, and then they would go person to person and stab them with bayonets because many pretended to be asleep or pretended to be killed, and then they would machine gun them again several times for good measure. This place was not discovered until 1999 because the discussion of these things was, again, strictly forbidden in Yugoslavia, because if you started to question the foundation that the country was built on, which, you know, the communists have to cultivate, you know, an image of honor and valor, which partisans did have. I'm not saying that being a partisan isn't wrong, because if you have an occupier as brutal as the Nazis, then take a pot shot at them. If they start killing people, bring the war to them. But after the war, doing this to people at prisoner of war camps and concentration camps, as they did, no real excuse for it, I think. And this was, again, just discovered just a few years after the fall of Yugoslavia. And this was a time when it could finally be openly talked about. Similar to, I don't know if I'm drawing a correct similarity, but like perestroika, where you could finally talk about things like Katyn and the Red Terror in Russia, this is finally being talked about. And the agency that was tasked with discovering these graves has discovered hundreds of them across the country. We're going to next, hopefully, a concentration camp that held these people. And the stories of the camp are pretty brutal. So all around the forest behind me, there are the graves, mass graves. It covers this entire clearing of civilians of the Sternal camp. And the Sternal camp was a Yugoslavian communist concentration camp that was designed to imprison German civilians. So they weren't really much involved with the Third Reich, but they had the name, the German-sounding name, and it made them a target. And altogether, I believe around 3 million Germans died just in the revenge killings that followed World War II. Sternal camp, right across the street, I'll try to show some photos of it, is an industrial plant. And in keeping with the Yugoslav way, to deny these crimes, they would build industrial plants and parking lots on top of sites of massacres and concentration camps. And all over the ground around here, you can see the pits where they put the bodies. And it was designed for 2,000 people, but it was packed to 6 times the capacity. Not a single person over the age of 2 survived the camp. 5,000 people died here, just in this camp alone. Many more were just taken off into the woods and shot by the local partisan units. And similar conditions to the typhoid and the mental torture and anguish and random executions and forced confessions. And there's even a story about a regular activity at this camp at Sternal was lining them up and having a partisan run a motorcycle over them while other partisans stood by and laughed. So it's eerie seeing the little memorials that are scattered around here. I'll try to get a better look at them. It was only discovered in 2007. Here's the mass grave, and the road's right over here along the forest line. And also in the Sternal camp section, there are several grave markers for Slovenes who fought in the Slovenian Home Army against the Russians and the communists. There's another marker over here. I think they were lined up in the corner, whereas the Germans were put up all across this section. But there was more than just Germans that died here, but the Sternal camp right across the road was mainly targeting Germans, or so I've read. This is the factory right across the street. There's an older building that may have actually been around during the executions. Behind me is the memorial to Tiharye concentration camp. Unlike the concentration camp we just visited to the northeast, Sternal, this one was designated mostly for Slovenian citizens, Home Guard, along with a few other ethnic German civilians and Axis members, soldiers from the war. So, because the victors write the history, the entire site was bulldozed, and it was only very recently that it got a memorial. but thousands of people were killed extrajudicially. Again, they think they killed 150,000 people, and that's just a rough estimate, and many of them were here. Now, it's closed now because it's a little bit later at night, but the thing that I'm trying to convey throughout this video is that it wasn't war criminals who were being killed exclusively. It was a lot of civilians that were being killed by communists, essentially as a part of a Red Scare that the US and Western Europe sort of just looked the other way to. And even after the war, to this day, I can see the smokestacks over here. They built on top of these sites. They put parking lots, they put chemical factories, they put garbage dumps. In fact, most of the graves from the camp behind me, they're in a underneath the golf course right over here, and I believe a chemical waste factory just up the hill. And that's where they would dump most of the bodies in a mass pit. And those were created sometime in the 1970s, I believe. But it was always known that a camp was here. But of course, after Yugoslavia became a communist country, it became impossible to talk about these things. And it only started really being realized the scope and horror of the crimes that were committed in the 1990s to early 2000s. But by then, most people don't care. Because, not to say that the Holocaust is not a thing that needs to be remembered, because of course it needs to be remembered. 6 million Jews died as a low estimate, and then millions of other people died. It wasn't just the Jews, it was also the Roma and just the Poles, the populations. It was a bloodbath in Europe. And we need to remember these things, and we're taught to remember them from a young age. But the persecution of people who were just ethnic civilians here in Slovenia and in Russia, and the Japanese who were used as POW labor for years, and it's a lot of lives get lost in the history books. And it's very convenient for people to just look the other way. But behind me, this is kind of an echo of the past that is trying to say that there are dozens of extra books that you could write about the things that happened when the war was over. And I think it's interesting to come and explore these places because it's just interesting to see them yourself. It's like Auschwitz. If the Germans had won and were defeated decades later, and people had just forgotten about it. Because behind me, although many war criminals met their end, it was a lot of just innocent people. I'm going to keep this as respectful as possible, and some of the photos and videos I'll be showing are very graphic, so be warned of that. But I think that the pit behind me, Barbary Pit, demonstrates exactly what I've been saying all day today. And in the last few minutes of daylight, I think that it's fitting to visit. Now, Barbary Pit was only explored in 2008. Now, people knew that something happened here, but it was forbidden to talk about it. You could never talk about this in Yugoslavia. That's because they led 1,400 people, more than 1,400, into this mine and massacred them. And most of this massacre happened in the back of the mine. So when investigators first opened it up, it was in 2008. And this opening took months to just move the concrete from the front of the mine. Once they got that done, the first thing they saw on the inside was horrifying. People survived the massacre and tried to escape, but the communist authorities had blocked the doors and already started piling up concrete. Their bodies were twisted and distorted as if they screamed, like their mouths were open, the skeletons. And these investigators made their way into the back of the mine and found a mass pit. Now, what had happened was the first batch of bodies were discovered, I think around 430, and then some days later they found 370. And what was done was they were crammed into the back of the mine, forced to lay down on the bodies of the people who died before them, and finish off with pickaxes to the back of the head. Some of them were crowded in corners and had grenades lobbed at them. And again, many of them survived this or played dead. And I think it would have been a much more merciful death to just be shot. But some of the people unfortunately played dead, and I was seen with the initial opening of the mine. Now, thankfully, they have been buried with dignity somewhere else. And I think one of the things that demonstrates how unknown this history is the Inspector General, I believe, of Slovenia was the first person in. And he described what he saw as horrific, because it was. And these were, many of them just civilians. Many of them just had German-sounding names. And many of them were, you know, they weren't friendly with the partisans, or they were apprehensive about the falling behind the Iron Curtain. So they were lumped in, just these civilians, into the mine behind me. The president was asked why he wasn't at this mine, because he was 10 kilometers away at an International Women's Day event. And his response was, this is a quote, "I will not be bothered by second-rate stories. If this was a pit discovered of victims of the Germans, of the Nazis, he would have, there is no doubt he would have been there. And if he wasn't there, he would have apologized for it. He wouldn't have called it second-rate." And that's rightfully so. Any sort of civilian death, Holocaust, Red Scare, White Scare, any scare, deserves memorialization. And I am just glad to hear that these people eventually got buried with dignity, and just keeping it respectful as possible. I hope that they find something, I hope they find a nice afterlife. And I hope that their suffering on earth wasn't in vain.
Pravi je bio zapažen z one strane, ne? Tam je glina. Malo počakajte, jaz te kontroliram zrak, bomo takoj šli gor naprej. Kar počas, še malo niže.
Sam, če mi sekundu date, še da tim učil, da bom šel čist na makro. Velika.
Cela pet še vedno redi, to ena pa pol je to še.
Tukaj zdaj že precej smrdi.
Precej smrdi.
Obleke. Tu so smete se zruške. Obleke. Jašek.
Evo ga pred nami.
Čakaj, počasno.
Spet. Tle desno je proga proti čelu, tle je kontakt, bi rekel, z premogom, med premogom pa Apnencem, in je verjetno bila lesena podgradnja.
O, pater!
Kaj pa je to?
Ja, že što napete pogledat, no?
O, porka,
ja, že što. Še zdaj smrdi. Ja, že što.
Zdaj pa neč več ne bi bilo primera, kako obštene plekeste, ne? Ne bi posnamete.
Ja, že što. Ja, že što.